Fighting Street for the TurboGrafx-CD, or in my case a re-released version on the original Wii Virtual Console, is a home conversion of the original Street Fighter arcade game from 1987 by Capcom. Why they changed the name is a mystery to all, or at least to those who cannot be bothered to look up this information because it really doesn't matter. Anyway, Fighting Street, for those who don't know, places you in control of Player 1, Ryu, or Player 2, Ken. And the main goal is to naturally go all over the world and win matches in a best-of-3 format. You do this by beating the crap out of your opponents with a variety of punches, kicks, and super secret special moves that are executed with familiar movements but are extremely difficult to execute. But when you do pull them off, they have the potential to do considerable damage. You also have bonus rounds where you can possibly earn extra continue credits and stuff. That's about all there is to it. It's a more primitive game compared to what one may be familiar with today. For all intents and purposes, Fighting Street is a near-perfect conversion of the original Street Fighter arcade game, which means crap controls with long delays between button press and execution, floaty jumping mechanics, bouncy shuffles as opposed to straight up walking, and lacking anything resembling good wholesome fun even by the primitive standards of 1987. Actually, as a matter of fact, the controls here might be a tad more crap since the TurboGrafx gamepad at the time only had 2 buttons. And so it seems like a bit more effort to pull off the fierce variation of your standard punches and kicks. It's not like those arcade variants with the 2 push buttons where the harder you hit, the fiercer the attack. It's not the case here. As a result, you'll most likely be mashing buttons and pelting away with quick jabs that do minimal damage, all the while the computer AI is completely unfazed by the shift and control scheme and will relentlessly beat on you with their full power and far superior agility. And make no mistake, Fighting Street is just as difficult and frustrating as its arcade original, and not necessarily for the right reasons, as it were. Fighting Street manages a fair approximation of the original Street Fighter's graphical prowess, such as it is, as every bit of character art, background, and doohickey has been faithfully replicated over to the home console. There is a bit of a rough quality to some of the visuals, but doesn't detract too heavily. I only regard the graphics highly here because it does come off as a sort of splitting image of the arcade original, save for some minor differences, even though the original Street Fighter's graphics were nothing to write home about with its plain Jane, tubby, stubby characters and stuff. Your typical 1980s arcade graphics, I used to call it. Given that this was a TurboGrafx-CD game, Fighting Street takes advantage by remixing the soundtrack so it doesn't sound like tinny arcade music and more like CD quality music. This goes without saying, of course, but the upgrade is a considerable improvement. What was originally generically placid sounding arcade tunes have now become something with a bit more oomph to it and a bit more listenability to it, if that makes sense. Or maybe that's just a convoluted way of my saying that the music sounds much better here by default. Mind you, it's still not the greatest soundtrack ever composed for a video game. Like I said when I did the Street Fighter arcade review back in 2012, nobody is going to fondly remember the tunes enough to want to check out non-existent remixes on that overclocked remix site. But it is something resembling music at the very least. The voiceovers of the arcade game have been retained, of course, and you now get the familiar move cries like Hadouken rather than Fight Fire or whatever they called it back then, or whatever, I don't know. It's been a while. God damn it. Overall, Fighting Street is about as good of a game as its arcade original Street Fighter. And that's not a good thing, by the way. The original Street Fighter was a clunky, cantankerous mess of a game with a good idea that merited a sequel or two, but is undone by crap controls, awkward gameplay, and no real reason to replay. And Fighting Street manages to retain those flaws, and on 2 buttons on top of that. That's pretty impressive, actually. This is one of those games that you track down a physical copy purely for collector's purposes, and one of those games you dab off the Virtual Console or wherever it's available purely out of some morbid curiosity. But there's nothing here that merits extended and repeated playthroughs. Bottom line, if you really want to see where it all began, stick with Street Fighter 2. The entire franchise, after all, was built on top of that game, not this one.